you so much for joining. My name is Iseline. I am the Advocacy Officer at Lake Health and Wellbeing. For those of you who do not know Lake Health and Wellbeing, we are a public health NGO based in St. Kitts and Nevis. And our goal and mission, what we do is essentially we do different projects, programs, campaigns to improve the health and well-being of our communities. That's the mission, that's what we're about. And so part of our mandate, we're also trying to increase capacity of other NGOs and CSOs organizations so that you can also be effective in doing your work, especially in the area of public health, since that's where we work in. But of course, the information is beneficial to organizations that work in other sectors, since we know public health is in everything. So we're really happy to have you join us. And today we have, the topic is project management. And I'm really pleased to introduce and welcome Miss Novia McKay. So Novia is a project management coach and change management practitioner. She has over a decade of experience working in the project management sector. She has worked with nonprofit organizations, international agencies, as well as in the private sector, doing traditional project management, as well as technological-based project management. So she has an array of experience, and she's going to deliver us a presentation, and you'll have an opportunity to ask her questions at the end. We encourage people to engage, use the chat if you have questions or anything like that. So I'll turn it over to Novia, and she will take us from here and just get into the session. So thank you all very much. Novia, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Iseline, and it's a pleasure to meet everyone. So I think we have a few participants online. We're expecting that folks will continue to join over the course of the presentation. However, it's Saturday morning, and I know in addition to this wonderful engagement, we probably all have our regular Saturday errands and to-dos. So we're gonna have a lively and interactive conversation and get started. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Let me see if I'll get this to work properly. All right, and can you confirm if you're seeing our slideshow?
Yes, seeing the slideshow.
All right, awesome. So who is Novia? So I am a Jamaican born and raised girl from the Caribbean. I have been working in projects for a very long time. I would say since even before leaving college, because in college I volunteered for the Red Cross and worked on the United Way and did some work there in terms of projects. I have a master's in communication for social and behavior change, and I'm also a certified project management professional. I'm pursuing additional accreditations in agile methodologies and eventually change management. As mentioned before, I've worked both in the nonprofit sector as well as in the private sector, the for-profit sector, which gives me an interesting perspective of both sides or multiple sides of the world of project management. I have particular interest in change management, change management methodologies, organizational transformations, etc. Because change for me is the other side, the human side of project management, which is very much a grounded methodology. All right, so in terms of today's conversation, this is a second part in a three-part series. So my colleagues on the line, and I would love for Elizabeth Atherley and Shelley Trim to say hi at this moment, would be delivering to the participants, 3 courses in a series. So the first presentation was done by Elizabeth, and it covered the grant writing process, effective grant writing. And then the second is being delivered by myself, which is project management. So once you've gone out, how do you get the grants? How do you write the grant proposal? How do you get the grants? And then how now we're going to be talking about, well, how do you make a successful implementation of the grant that you may have been awarded? right? And then following that, the third part in the series, Shelley Trim will be speaking about monitoring and evaluation. So I would love if Shelley and Elizabeth, if you could just introduce yourselves as well. You're both on the call, so that the participants can say hi and get to know you a little better.
Elizabeth, you can go ahead.
Oh, hello everyone. Nice to see you. If you were with us last month, I did the workshop on grant writing, and so welcome. And I think it's going to be a great day today, and I'm excited to hear what Novia will have to say. And Shelley?
Hi, good morning. I'm Shelley Trim. I'm based in Jamaica. I will be ending this workshop series now that you have your grant, now that you've been, and then Novia today will be talking about good project implementation. I'll help you look further into not only just managing in terms of good monitoring and evaluation practices to make sure that you are able to be a success. So I look forward to seeing you again, maybe next month. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, ladies. All right, I'm just adjusting my configuration here so that I can actually see who is on the call at the same time as my presentation. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. All right, so hold on one second. All right, so why are we here today? We're going to talk a little bit about why we're here, which is projects and project management. And then we'll go into a discussion about what the transition looks like between grant writing to project planning and execution, and some of the main tenets of designing and executing a project successfully. And we'll talk through some best practices, common risks and challenges, and then essentially what are some of the key skills and qualities that a successful or effective project manager should work to cultivate. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. But before we actually do that, I'd love to get a sense of who do we have with us today. So who is in the room? We don't have that many folks joined as yet. And so I think we can take a few persons. What we'd love to know is, tell us a little bit about your organization and the work that you do. And most importantly, I'd love to know, why did you have an interest in joining this session? What's your entry point into wanting to learn or talk about or be more exposed to project management? Because what I find is that, folks come to the field of project management from many, many different directions. And so it's a good sense to kind of get a lay of the land and help to guide the conversation going forward. So I will open it up. Feel free to raise your hand to go first, or if not, you can just jump in. But, let's get a sense of who you are, why you're here, and what you actually hope to get out of this session.
Seems everybody's shy this morning, Novia.
Well, I'll give a couple of seconds for folks to warm up. All right, go ahead, Zara.
Hi, good morning. I'm Zara. I work with two groups, the St. Kitts Mental Health Association and the Advancement for Children Foundation. And I am here because it just seems that I'm running from project to project with no clear management. We just are so reactive in things that we do. And I want to be inspired to slow down and think to execute them and incorporate monitoring and evaluation. So I'm here for some tools so that the direction can feel more effective.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, and nice to meet you, Zara. All right, can we get a couple more responses? I see Simone. Hi, Simone.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Simone Bishop Matthews. I'm actually a Healthy Caribbean Youth member, and I'm a program assistant at CAFA. I was really interested in this webinar because I've only recently kind of dabbled in project management, and I think it would be good to, learn the basics. And my job, it seems to entail a lot of project management skills. So I'm looking forward to the session today.
Okay, awesome. Nice to meet you, Simone.
Good morning, everyone. I am Cynthia
morning.
Polius Prescott. I've been an educator for 44 years. I work with the National Enrichment and Learning Unit of the Ministry of Education in St. Lucia. Why I'm interested, I now have retired, but I'm currently coordinating a project, which is the Skills for Youth Employment Project, SKY project. And I just want to get some more enlightenment on project management.
Okay, awesome. Could you say again the project that you're currently coordinating?
Skills for Youth Employment Project. It's
Skills
SKY.
for Youth
SKY,
Employment.
yes, it's a funded project. It's funded by the UK government, and we
Okay.
started
The British Council?
It's pardon me?
Is it with the British Council? Is that the
No,
funder?
not the British country. No, not the British Council. No, it's from UK aid from the British government. And this project started in 2019, but we have completed training, and we are now at the assessment and certification stage. And also internship.
Okay, internships, education, etc.
Yes.
Okay, all right, awesome. Thank you, Cynthia.
Yes, you're welcome.
Okay, Lydia, want to go ahead?
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So I'm here today because I am interested in the field of project management, and I have been contemplating starting the PMP. I have dabbled in a few projects before, but don't actually have the formal skill set. And so hence the reason why I'm here today. I'm not working on any project in particular at this point in time. But I found the webinar pretty interesting and decided to come on.
All right, well, welcome. And you have an interest in projects, so it's always a good idea to start somewhere.
Exactly, thank you.
All right, awesome. Can we take one or two more persons?
We had two persons put things in the chat, Bernadette and Claudine.
Okay. Shelly, do you mind reading what's in the chat?
Okay, sure. From Claudine, says, good morning, everyone. I'm Claudine Lewison. I'm a youth worker and I'm interested in this webinar because with my job, project management skills comes in handy as I'm responsible for running various projects in my zone, and I'm also interested in the field of project management.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, Bernadette says, good morning, everyone. I am Bernadette and I'm connecting from St. Lucia. I have decided to join this session as a refresher. I am a nurse manager and I believe some of the components of the session can be beneficial to me because I do plan, coordinate, and implement activities.
Okay, awesome. And I think I see Caliste. Are you unmuted? Did you want to jump in? Okay, I'm not sure if you're having audio issues, but
we can't hear you, Calista. You wrote in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me actually open the chat. No, we're not hearing you. Do you want to rejoin your audio?
What about you, Lancer?
Okay, yes, you can go ahead, Calista, and send in the chat.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually joining here from the last one that you guys had on grant writing. So I'm kind of following through with that. But for everybody else who wasn't on that call, I am a St. Lucian born, St. Lucian raised, but now I reside in Anguilla, educator. And because I teach at a private school where we run different programs, I'm here in that capacity. I would like to learn more about project management so I can engage in creating programs for our school and making sure everybody and everything runs on track.
Okay, awesome. And I think Calista is going to drop her comments in the chat. So just from who we've had here today, so we have folks in health, a couple of folks that are associated with government institutions. We have a few folks that are here in education or youth development. We have a youth worker, and then we also have someone who is working with children, mental health, and health generally. So we have, and then we have one person who is contemplating going into project management, maybe not necessarily associated with a nonprofit. So we have a good, a fairly wide representation here in the room. And what I really appreciate about just getting to know who is here is the fact that we see that projects really interacts with many, many fields. So there are many different directions or perspectives, industries that you can come from and still have a common connection, which is either an interest in projects or experience, whether it is formal or informal in project management, right? And that is what I think is the part of the appeal as well as the power of projects, right? So in terms of why we talk about it, well, you all brought your own reasons in terms of why is it necessary, or why you have an interest based on your work, based on your organization, or maybe based on what you're observing the needs are to talk about projects. And the truth is that projects right now and project-oriented work is driving our world. So not just from a nonprofit perspective, but from private sector, from government, medical industry, automotive industry, our world is becoming increasingly projectized because our world continues to change rapidly, right? So that means that no matter what, as things evolve, as things integrate, as new methods, approaches, and challenges emerge, one of the tried and true ways of responding to those changes has to do with successfully designing and implementing projects. Excuse me. I think Calista has spoken in the chat. Oh, it's Johnny Caliste. So we were like getting you totally wrong. I'm so sorry. Your last name appeared first. So I'm really glad that you posted in the chat. Okay, you're a project officer, grant fund manager, and does M&E. You work with organizations to apply for grants and own a training school that is also doing Sky Training. So Sky Training, I believe, is a skills for youth employment that Cynthia mentioned. Okay, I saw the ad and decided to join, as I'm always open to learning. I'm not sure if I may be too experienced for this session since I also do training. So Johnny, probably I can call on you to support some of the discussion. So this is a session that is designed to be more of a conversation. It's designed to be more of an introduction and kind of setting the stage. So Johnny, it sounds like you're already well versed and well integrated in the field of project management. But nonetheless, I hope that there is value for you in the conversation. And please feel free to jump in and support. All right, so just kind of setting the stage of where things are. So, and supporting the point of projects are driving our world, right? So recently there was a cyclone that affected a number of countries in Africa, Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and you can see there in the image just the scope of the devastation, of the impact of the flooding would have been quite massive. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people would have been impacted by this, right? So in part of the response, right, UNICEF, which is one of the major international organizations, and it's known as one of the most effective international organization. They do deliver globally billions of dollars in terms of aid via projects, right? So in what they've formulated as their response packages, or their response package to this natural disaster event, is just an excerpt is listed there. So their response will focus on health, cholera response and prevention. Of course, you'd have had flooding, so you would now have the risk of waterborne diseases. They'll have an education intervention to minimize service disruption and safe access to schools. So, you know, perhaps there were landslides, or there were areas that now flooded out, and so places may be cut off from access to schools and other amenities. So they're looking at an intervention to minimize that. They're protection, care, and for internally displaced persons. So that might include relocation, identifying new suitable homes or communities with which to move people that are not as flood prone. It may also include interventions for access to clean and safe water, increased use of sanitation facilities, nutrition, and preventing the effects of malnutrition, mortality attributed to same. So right in this, so here we have natural disaster events, which are becoming more frequent and more severe. So whether it's drought, which some countries in Africa also are experiencing, as well as here in the Caribbean, or flooding or extreme temperatures, various changes due to climate change are driving natural disasters. Now, even though it may be posed as disaster relief, which is accurate, this is one of the areas that's driving continuous need for project execution. So in this paragraph alone, speaking about the response to the flooding and in affecting these countries, you probably have like 5 to 8 projects just within what needs to be done to address this issue here. Funds will need to be mobilized, people will need to be mobilized, and specific short to medium term results will need to be achieved to mitigate against the impact of the cyclone. So you will always find that right here, you need the skills to be able to effectively plan and execute projects to address this very real life issue, right? So projects driving in the area of disaster relief and response to natural disasters, health emergencies. If we zone in on Malawi, right, one of the countries impacted by the cyclone. I mean, you can see from the image, these are persons signing up for the clinic for health checks post the storm, right? These are the picture on the bottom right are folks that are now in temporary dwellings related to it. Now, even outside of this particular disaster, there are over 900 NGOs that are operating in Malawi, right? And those are just ones that are receiving some form of UK funding. Together, they're delivering around £2.3 billion in the countries, which is almost 3% of UK's total charity spending. So you can see that the volume of resources, even in the nonprofit world, that's being dedicated to essentially projects. I mean, much of it does go to administration, organization, pay, compensation for international aid workers, but you still count those as costs to deliver the work and the results that we're looking for through projects, right? If we look at an example, so something like hurricane relief would be projects on a very grand scale, because you're talking about now, impacting thousands of people to relocate, etc. If you zone in on a smaller scale, an example of the Jeff Small Grants program in Jamaica, they've been consistently mobilizing international funds to specifically empower local organizations to implement work in a number of areas. So there's biodiversity protection, training and capacity development, climate change, work concerning international waters, land degradation, multiple areas. They've delivered more than 100 projects in Jamaica alone since 2005. Now the total grant amounts are smaller, because as you can see, the amount of total funding, when you count in kind, the cash, and the grants, is looking like about 5 and 7, 12 to 15 million US dollars. So smaller grants over a longer period of time. You can see that to have implemented over 100 projects is a pretty good success rate. You know, there is a high likelihood or many risks to failure for projects, and I'm sure most of us on the call have either been involved with or observed a project that hasn't been extremely successful. So, you know, you can be delivering projects on the micro level, which is working in a community, looking at a very specific niche issue, as well as looking at projects on the grander scale, which are solving some of the big environmental and other health related crises, which are only becoming more and more frequent. An emerging area that's in terms of the nonprofit world and even the for-profit world that would speak of has to do with technology. An increasing number of nonprofits, in particular in, you know, more developed countries, unfortunately, are using are technology directed. They're either deploying technology to solve problems, or they are technology providers, or they're working on distributing tools. So I've just given a few examples here. So Empower is a nonprofit that is dedicated to looking up to having technology become more of a social good. So they have a service core, which includes mentoring and career development for persons who wouldn't typically have access to STEM education, right? And then they have a community arm, which is where they bring the volunteering to connect tech professionals with high impact nonprofits, right? You have code.org, which is an education innovation nonprofit, which is primarily based in America, but now expanding internationally. And they are focused on expanding access to computer science in schools and increasing participation of women and women from underrepresented groups. So now their aim, they've already delivered the coding technology to about 70 million students and 2 million teachers. Embedded within that are the project related roles to help to drive implementing that technology and directing that technology towards solving problems. So the main problem that they're looking at is, okay, not enough women and underserved populations have access to technology education to allow them to be more competitive, command a higher salary, you know, solve their own problems. So they have a number of projects directed at increasing access. Then there's another company, another nonprofit that's distributing a tool, the Kobo Toolbox. So they would have created a tool that is basically now being transformed into a platform for humanitarian data collection. So going back to, okay, your projects, your disaster relief projects, your flood relief projects, there is a nonprofit that is essentially providing a tool to support projects like that in collecting and then harmonizing needs assessment data, which can then be used to further inform and drive other projects. So embedded within this is, of course, the fact that you would need to have project skills, continuing to expand the tools, expand the platforms, to work with agencies to start implementing and adopting these and other technology tools, which are essentially projects or initiatives. So if you look at the landscape in from the large to the small, from the analog to the digital, projects and project work is really driving and supporting the implementation and or adaptation to various forms of change. So change is happening all around us. Our earth is changing based on how we interact with it and our practices, right? The way that our needs of our populations are changing based on how these broader environmental, political, socio-economic changes are affecting them. And so the primary method or vehicle for delivering responses to these changes is via projects, right? So I wanted to start with this perspective because, you know, regardless of whether you've done it casually or you've studied formally, whether you did it in the past or you're doing it now, the reality is that project management is a critical and in-demand skill, right? So whether you're in government or you're in a nonprofit or you're in private sector, becoming very good at managing projects and being more effective at managing projects means that donors, communities, and employers will entrust you with additional funding to help you grow. You'll be able to attract more complex grants and partnerships, or from a personal perspective, you'll be able to go after different types of jobs and really become more attractive to potential employers when you can demonstrate that you have a grounding in effective project management, that you can come in, you can see a body of work to be done, you can take concrete steps to plan and to execute successfully and demonstrate your results. So no matter which area you're in, project management skills are really critical and can only serve to enhance and support what it is that you're doing, which I think resonates with the reason why many of you are here today. So whether it is in your job, your work, what you're studying, what your organization is aiming to do, project management and effective delivery of projects is you have identified that as a relevant and necessary skill. And all of the trends external to this conversation are also pushing in the same direction. Now, essentially, project management formally is a methodology, right? So it's a methodology that would have been initially documented and developed primarily in the for-profit world, right? So traditionally, you would think of project management, you would think of the realm of construction, building buildings, roads, infrastructure, but also building systems and processes, and then in the last 15 to 20 years, implementing and delivering technology in whichever field, whether it is finance, health, automotive, etc. Now, the documentation of the process and the methodology, which is really what distinguishes formal project management, would have resided in the for-profit sector. But of course, we all know here that in the nonprofit world, though it may be treated differently, the skills of project management are extremely relevant. Now, some of the key differences, of course, in a for-profit scenario, projects are usually driven by shareholders or management. There is usually greater resources to hire professional paid staff to implement projects, whereas in the nonprofit world, the project work is usually volunteer or donor funder driven. You're usually funded or largely executed by volunteer staff, probably with fewer professional staff that are more than likely underpaid or not as well paid, because of course with a nonprofit it's a constant cycle of fundraising, implementation, and staff tends to roll on and off, right? So usually in a for-profit scenario, projects are being implemented for some kind of profit-based driver, increased efficiencies, revenue growth, market share, or you're delivering critical infrastructure, etc. Whereas we know that the drivers for nonprofits are usually solving some kind of a problem, right? So there are some differences in the orientation and in the resourcing of projects depending on where you are. And in fact, I started my journey in project management in the nonprofit world, and it was, even in my experience 10 or so years ago, it wasn't called project management. You know what I mean? You were a coordinator, or you were a lead, or you were, something else, but they were not as focused in gathering and applying the strict methodology. Every nonprofit that I worked at did their projects a different way. There were some things that were common. Okay, you have a project proposal where you look at your beneficiaries and your activities, but the kind of systematic methods to apply to project management were not as strongly focused on in the nonprofit world. However, it's still extremely relevant, because what's happening now is that donors, communities, average citizens are demanding a greater level of accountability, right? They're looking to see which nonprofits or organizations are making an impact and can demonstrate the impact. What have you done with the funding that has been given to you? We've given you a grant. What have you achieved? We've given our donations. We've come in and volunteered. What change has been made? What has been the result? And so with the increasing demand for accountability and for the demonstration of results, nonprofits in particular need to really work and transition from looking at, okay, I'm going to fundraise here for what's available in the industry, etc., to, what is our overall strategy? Look at your work in terms of an overall program that has a strategic direction, and then seek your funding for delivering projects which are going to relate to your overall program objective. People now don't respond the same way to, okay, community fund my ongoing good work. That type of vague language to say, all right, just trust us, we're doing good, is not really flying anymore. We all need to be able to demonstrate results. And to be able to demonstrate results, one, you need to know specifically what your objective is. You need to be able to execute it effectively. And then you need to collect the information and the data that's going to help you to communicate about what it is that you've done and make the case that you should get additional funding, that the stakeholders or the donors or the volunteers should continue to invest in this work because you are good stewards of their resources, right? And so in this series, we would have started out talking about, okay, well, how do you frame the grant proposal in a way that is realistic, achievable, but also meeting the needs? Now we'll talk about, well, now that you've been successful, how do you actually plan and execute in a successful way? And then in the M&E session, we'll talk about, well, how do you monitor the activities that you're implementing? How do you launch a good evaluation so that at the end of it now, you can demonstrate to your various stakeholders the success of what it is that you've been doing? So all of these three elements come with particular best practices, particular methodologies to help you with particular tools and tips to help you to do it more effectively. All right. So now that you've won the grant, what's next? Ladies, I think we can launch the first poll question, which is, have you ever been directly responsible for planning and implementing a project once a grant is received? So have you, maybe you wouldn't have been the person who wrote the successful proposal, but would any of you have been the one that it falls on your table? Yes, and this is your baby, you're going to take it up from the next step.
So we've received responses from 8 of you. Anyone else want to answer the poll?
All right, so about 60% of folks on the call have been directly responsible for implementing a project once a grant has received, and about 45%, 4 out of 9, have not been, but maybe you would have participated in some way, shape, or form. Okay, great. So for those of you who have done so, over the course of the next section of the presentation, we'll take some comments from you about, what would you have done or what would have been your process, right? So the next section of the presentation is going to talk about a little bit more about the project life cycle. So where we're going to start is around initiation, and then we'll speak a little bit about the detailed planning process, your actual execution, your whole closing and handover. And of course, monitoring and reporting will be covered in the next presentation. So for those of you who would have responded yes, can anyone tell me about what would have been immediately once you would have gotten the news or you would have been hired to say, okay, the grant proposal was successful, you're getting funding. Can 1 or 2 persons tell me a little bit about what was your next step? Like, what's the first thing that you did or that your organization did when it became successful at receiving a grant?
usually get to planning.
Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
All right, so tell me a little bit about that, what that process looked like for you.
We would typically meet after receiving the word on the grant. We typically meet to review our work plan and then see how we're going to implement or actively plan who will do what, delegate responsibilities.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I see Bernadine has put in the chart, a plan on the execution and how the resources will be utilized. And we'll get back to the scenario, right? So exactly as you said, even before you get into the planning, you've now received a grant. Sometimes there is a time lag between when you would have gotten the funding to be able to start or gotten even the advice of being a successful awardee. Sometimes it's weeks, months. I mean, I've even seen a point of view where you don't start implementing your project based on the grant process cycle until 9 months, a year, even after a proposal would have already been written. Right. So as the colleagues have said, one of the first things that you want to do is, go back and look at your proposal. Look at what you would have submitted or committed to do. And of course, if your grantee organization has given any feedback or has any specific objectives, then you want to review that as well, so that as you start the planning process, you're actually recalling what were the commitments that were promised when you would have made the proposal. What was the basis on which your proposal was received? Of course, you'd have to consult with your stakeholders to see if any assumptions or conditions may have changed. So this is where we talk about planning for our needs assessment, right? So even though you may have had to do some planning upfront, or your organization who wrote the proposal may have had to do some planning upfront, the fact is that now that you're about to start implementing, you want to take some time to actually confirm, have any assumptions changed? Are there any additional areas that we now need to consider? Has anything happened in the space that would now change or impact our original idea? You may want to use that first initiation period to get some core team members enrolled. So for instance, if you're a nonprofit that you don't have your project management team on staff, you recruit as needed based on when you get the grant funds, then you may now need to go and identify a project manager and an M&E officer to start the planning process. So those are a few things that you would do to kind of get in gear. And what I like to call, or in the more formal project management state, is initiate it. Identify who your key stakeholders are, your resources, and then most importantly, go back and look at what it is that this grant proposal entails. Are there any conditions that speak to stuff that you have to meet, timelines, etc. Right? That's one of the key areas. Now, I'd love a little feedback on the key elements of a project plan. Now, are there any of these that you would see here that would not be a key element of a project plan from your experience?
You can put it in the chat. You can put it in the chat. I was just saying persons can put it in the chat.
Yes, no problem. You can respond in the chat. Right, so you have a peer review, budget, M&E plan, board members, expected results, scope, description of your project, details of the funding agency, project governance body or advisory board. Which of these do you think you would could exclude from your project plan when developing it? Or if you want to go to converse, which of these do you think are critical?
Not seeing any responses.
All right, so for instance, I would not necessarily, sorry, somebody jumping in. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yes. Sorry, I was just saying that monitoring and evaluation plan. I think this is critical because too often some projects fail because we do not have a monitoring plan in place. So
Absolutely.
upfront, there must be a plan so that you can continue to do your reflection and your assessment. That should be ongoing.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that sometimes it gets left out, like you're at the end and you're saying, oh, well, how are we going to evaluate the results? But as you said, it's key to do it upfront so that your activities are planned, because your activities are already planned and executed, and then then it's much harder to go back and monitor it after. All right, Zara said I would not include an abstract because it's too early for a summary. I agree. I'm not sure. I would include an overview, but you know, the abstract at this point, that would be probably more suited to you presenting the results of your evaluation, etc. Any other comments on the areas of the slide or what you would or would not include in your project plan? Naomi, I think you admitted.
The budget and the scope are very important. You need to know what your project will be about, what it will entail and not entail. So those two are important, and in terms of how you will allocate your funds.
Precisely. Scope is very important because scope, your budget and your time are very closely related. And oftentimes we find that project proposals, you know, when we're going after the funding, tend to be extremely ambitious. You know, we're promising to do a training and to build a climate change adaptation, you know, water storage system, and educate an entire committee and a community and form an advisory board and improve 2 healthcare clinics and look at nutrition all in one project in a year or 2 years. You know, I've seen a lot of projects in the nonprofit sector written that way. And then what you find is that when you actually start now to do the detailed planning to build your budget, the resources are not enough, the time is not enough, or the activities can't be achieved as intended. So the scope and refining the scope from early on is very critical to the exercise. In things that I would include, I wouldn't include in your project plan your board members or too many details of the funding agency, because your board members are and the agency, your project plan is supposed to be laser focused on what you're executing, right? It's supposed to be laser focused on how you're going to achieve the objectives. So in terms of what your project plan should include, your overview with very strongly a statement of the need or your results of your needs assessment, how you're going to approach it, your goals and objectives, the high level scope, which you can elaborate via something like a logic model to help you to show the logical relationship between the goals that you want to achieve and the activities, or it could be a scope statement, or it could be or a list or a table of your major activities, outputs, and deliverables. You definitely want to articulate your stakeholders, in particular your intended beneficiaries, but also your partners, observers, data contributors, monitors, indirect beneficiaries, your governance bodies. And then you want to have some additional plans that are going to guide how you execute your M&E plan, your communication plan. So how are you going to keep your various stakeholders informed? Your work plan or your schedule, your budget, and of course, something for risk management, because within every project, within every change, risk is built in. And oftentimes we don't talk about the risk until the risk has occurred, until the risk has derailed our activities. Whereas if you identify and plan for the risks up front, then you have a better opportunity to mitigate against them. So if I spend a few minutes just kind of zoning in on some of these areas, right? Your problem statement or your needs assessment. Sorry, someone wants to jump in?
Oh, sorry, I put my hand up. I was thinking, what's about sustainability?
Not hearing you so clearly, Cynthia. Can you speak a little louder?
I'm just saying, what's about sustainability of the project? We know at some point the project has to end, but we're looking at the impact of the project in the future. I think we need to consider this in crafting the project?
Absolutely.
What is the life?
Absolutely.
What is the life beyond the project?
Absolutely. So what happens when this project is done? What happens when the money is finished and the activities are completed? Is it that everybody just goes back to life before and nothing happens, or is it that we have a method or a way to help to sustain? And totally agree, Cynthia. So definitely an oversight on the last slide, talking about sustainability at the beginning, similar to monitoring and evaluation. Talking about your sustainability at the top end means that you're much more likely to build in sustainable practices throughout the execution of the project. So you're much more likely to actually execute a sustainable project if at the beginning you've thought about how will these gains be sustained. And so thinking about that at the beginning as part of your planning is also a crucial or critical step. So thank you for that. Any other comments on the project plan? All right, so we're just going to spend like a couple of minutes just highlighting some key areas. All of the areas of your project plan are significant and will take time to do. And I'm just zoning in on a few for the purpose of this conversation. Highlighting around your problem statement or updating your needs assessment. It's really important to confirm and reconfirm the issue that you're trying to solve and what's the best approach to solving that issue. As I said earlier, many times there can be a delay between when you would have written a proposal and when you would have started. We need to understand if we've assessed and understood our stakeholders and what their needs are and if anything has changed. And needs assessment can be a broad formal exercise, or it can be a very rough or informal exercise in key informal interviews, focus groups, etc. Though the key thing is that we refine our assumptions, we collect the needs of our stakeholders and our beneficiaries, and we gather data that is relevant to planning for sustainability, to monitoring, right? And you try to do that, or at least reconfirm if a needs assessment was already done, then you'd want to do some amount of reconfirming. Are these assumptions still valid? When we talk about the logic model, which we'll do a short exercise on that after this, you're clarifying, you're linking your desired outcomes to your activities and then the inputs that you need to achieve them, right? So you are essentially ensuring that what you want to achieve at the impact or the outcomes is going to be supported by what you do now, what inputs you purchase or procure, and then how you apply them in terms of the activities. So getting that logical relationship, it helps to guide, and then the logic model is also a very useful communication tool. In terms of your stakeholders, of course, you want to identify who do you need for execution. So this would be your partners, your project team. Do you need a specialist in a particular area? Is there a technology component to your project? So therefore, you need persons with technical skills. Are you going to be building an app or doing training in media literacy? So for those items, you may need specialized resources. You should identify that now. And then you'd have already identified the beneficiaries from your needs assessment, but now we need to consider what about your governance for your project? Who's going to be your advisory board or your steering committee? Who are interested and affected parties that can help your cause or that may derail your cause if they do not feel that they are accounted for or considered? Who are beneficiaries, indirect beneficiaries or allies, media, civil society? How would you engage those stakeholders throughout the course of the project? Is there a strategic way to leverage the stakeholders that have an interest in this area to either help ensure the success of the project or to help you to execute or to sustain the gains once needed? Stakeholder analysis is going to be ongoing because new stakeholders will undoubtedly come up. However, spending time during your planning process to think through who are those key stakeholders and how you want to engage them will inform your planning process. Sometimes you have stakeholders, for instance, that require a lot of time to cultivate. They may not be easy to access. This type of planning early on allows you to see who they are, maybe start planting the seeds and engaging them from earlier on, such that when you actually need them or are ready to deploy them in your project, you would have already started that relationship. And then finally, of course, it goes without saying, your work plan and your budget. Now that you've collected all those items together, you've built out your logic model, you've identified your activities, right? You can start to pull together a realistic work plan along with your stakeholders. So a work plan and a budget shouldn't be an undertaking that you as a project manager alone do somewhere based off of your own thoughts. Even when you've gathered the data, you want to gather as much input as possible from your various stakeholders, those who you'll be working with, if you can work with the beneficiary community, to determine what is the work that's really required to execute and how much is it going to cost. So that at the end of the day, your estimates are realistic for the work that is required, including things like your preparation costs, your mobilization costs. You may have activities that you need to do to prepare your group or your infrastructure or your stakeholders to receive the project activities. That's the type of thing that you want to use your stakeholders and your resources at hand to help in planning your work plan, so that when you tell your funder or your donor that you're going to achieve these 10 activities in a year, you don't go 6 months down the line and say, well, you know, we actually had to lose some time because we had to get an agreement with the government, and that took 3 months. So by the time we got the agreement, we couldn't actually start until another month because we were interrupting the budget cycle of the organization. So we lost 6 months in mobilizing. That type of planning means that something was left on the table in terms of discussing what is realistically needed to execute. So it's very important at this beginning stage that you try not to be too ambitious and speak realistically about what it's going to take to achieve and execute the plans that you have and what you would have committed to in your grant proposal. Any comments or questions on this side? All right, so yes, I do see a hand. Celestine?
Yes, I wondered whether you had any tips on timing, because coming from the grant writing proposal workshop some time ago, and now looking at this one, I'm thinking how crucial the timing can be when you have to put some things in place before others can come up. So do you have any advice on that?
Okay, so let's talk a little more, Celestine. I would love you to give me an example, because do you mean timing in terms of putting together a successful grant proposal, or trying to be quick about pulling your work plan together so that you can meet the timelines for your grant?
More the latter.
Okay, so in terms of how do you plan the timing of your project activities?
Yes, precisely.
Okay, so Celestine, what area do you work in?
I'm an educator. I haven't done any projects, but I do work for a non-profit private school, and there are some action plans that we need to start looking at as a project, and they're also funded by we're funded, basically. That's how we run. And so, but there are things that we have to make sure that we have put in place for reporting back to our funder. So it's starting to look like, for me, that there are some things that you really need to make sure happens before you even start the project. And even while you're putting your grant forward, there are some things that you have to make sure that you have in place as well. So I don't have a particular example now, but I just wanted an idea of what comes first. It's a chicken or the egg thing for me in my head right now.
So like, what would be some of those objectives that you're, so it's a school, but you mentioned that there might be other initiatives that you guys have to accomplish.
Right. So one of our initiatives is to have a community center. Our school should act as a community center. And so we would need to put programs in place for maybe, let's say, a garden, or inviting other schools to a sporting program at our school, something like that. But it would
Okay, so
seem
let's
like
actually start there.
we would need to make connections with the schools before we put the grant forward. Kind of like that.
So for this community center, so right now you're operating as a school. So I assume that your educational activities are underway, your classes whatsoever, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so what you'd be adding to that now to enhance the work that your organization does is now expanding what you offer to not just school services to specific students that are registered, but a community-based approach whereby you have a multi-purpose center that
Correct.
other students and other persons in the community can come and interact with in some way.
Yes.
Okay, so you guys would be adding a component, maybe building out something for a community center. So, and you would have to do some further submission to your grantors or to your funders to say how you're going to accomplish that.
Right.
Okay. All right. So we can use that example because I like to use things that are relevant to your actual experience and what you might be doing now, right? So you're gonna say, okay, well, this is part of our mandate is to expand what we're doing into a community center. Where and how do we start? Now, before you go, because you mentioned that you would have to go back for funding to your grantors, right? So you want to go back to them with some sort of a plan that says, hey, we've thought about this, right? We know we have a vision for what we want to achieve, and this is how we're going to achieve it, right? So the first things that you would do, which would pick up back on some of the guidance from the grant writing, which you said that you were on, is, well, what's the vision that your organization, but also your constituents would have of a community center, right? So for the persons that you would serve, I don't know if your physical community is large or small, or if you're with a specific geographic zone, but what are the need, what would they want from a community center? Is a community center, what would be beneficial to your audience from establishing a community center? What do you want this community center to do? Is it to bring people together? Is it to get young people, off the streets? Is it to be able to offer services or additional training or mentorship for kids that are out of school or don't have access to education? Is it to teach practical principles? You mentioned a garden. Is it for just recreation, beautification, etc.? So even before, so whether or not you're going to apply for the grant or you have funds and you're going to use a project, you want to start here with your outcomes. Have a conversation with your various stakeholders as to what the needs are, and then determine from the needs what you want to achieve. So Celestine, is there a sense of what this community center should do as opposed to, okay, we'd like a community center? What would be the purpose of or the benefit of establishing this community center?
It's supposed to service young people in things that are not educational solely, but still has an educational aspect. So arts, environmental considerations, and basically recreation.
Okay. And it should primarily be targeted at, I guess, young people, school age children and adolescents.
Young people, yes.
Okay. Now, so you've started to identify, all right, it should be not just academic, but arts, environment, recreation. It should be rounded. It should serve young people or school age children, etc. Now, what would be based on what you know? Now, obviously, we're not doing a formal needs assessment now, but based on what you know, what does your audience need or not have, or what gap would this fill other than just to be able to do the recreation, etc.? What would they say that their need or their desire is?
Well, I think for now, without having done any formal assessment about it, it would be the gap would be just not having access to a lot of those services for either free or low cost.
Okay. So we want to fill a gap in terms of what young people have access to help them to become more rounded, learn about their environment without and to be able to make those services free or low cost, right? So then going from there, you would want to have some sort of a sketch of what that would look like. So for instance, your outputs now, do you already have a space that can serve as a community center? Or if you have a space, is it already retrofitted or outfitted as it needs to be? Would you need to do any renovation or refurbishment? Would you need to put in place any kind of infrastructure, running water, etc.? In addition to that, so that's the physical aspect of it. In addition to that, how would your programs and services be provided? Are you going to look for what you call it now, volunteers to teach art schools or run environment programs? Is it nonprofit yourself? Are you guys going to have a team or a staff that now supports this community center that will then offer those services? Or will you hire or have rotating guests that come in and serve it, right? Recreational activities, do you need to purchase stuff that would help with the recreation? Are you going to build a tennis court or a video game room, etc., etc.? So it would be an excellent opportunity to actually work with your stakeholders, call some kids together, do a focus group, and put together that vision and then identify what we need. Because of course, if you have an infrastructure need, meaning you need to build something or you need to refurbish something, then that comes with a very specific set of requirements in terms of your inputs or your activities. So you might have here in terms of your outputs, you might have, okay, we need physical restructuring. We need teachers and trainers. We need to procure equipment. We need to do a program or a plan, or we need staff. So some of these things you would want to think about before going back to your grantors for additional funding, because one, I'm assuming that you already have a set pool from which you would go back to raise funds. So maybe what they're looking for is a plan that's going to say, this is the vision for the community center. This is how we're going to achieve it, right? And then once you've listed those things out, so for instance, if one of your outputs is a physical space to purchase or to refurbish, others would be creating the program, one would be finding the staff, then those outputs would be what you'd be measuring to say, if we get those three things, I can know so that I've achieved my outcome. Looking at those outputs will now help you to guide in terms of what activities do you need to do for each of those. So for your refurbishing, for your implementing the program, etc. When you've started to lay these things together, then that gives you a better idea of the timing, as you mentioned before. So to go back to your earlier question, once you start to break down the work that is required to meet your outcomes or your outputs, you can start to have a sense of the timing. So I don't know, Celestine, are your grantors ones that they operate on a cycle, for instance? Do you have to get in requests for funding at a particular time of the year, or is it open enrollment that you can go at any time?
Both. One for our operations, it's on a cycle, and for the other one, you can go at different times in the year.
Okay.
So for that project, it would be something that you could access outside of the regular funding.
Okay, so so you're less constrained there with your timing, because once your team has started to figure out what it is that you want to do and have started to actually break down the activities and then the inputs that you need, which will then help you to build a work plan and a budget, you can take, say if you want to take 2 months or 3 months to do that planning process, you'll have flexibility to go to them and say, all right, we've articulated this vision, we've collected some needs, we would like to, we need X amount of funding, one-time funding to cover this part of the project, which is build the community center. And then we'll go back to our operational team, or grantors that fund our operations. We'll be able to take to them a staffing plan for the center. And we know that their budget cycle is April, right? So if we know that we can get funds by September to build a community center, Then by April, when we would have started building, we can now start to think about the staffing, and we can now approach our other funder about when we might need funds and how many staff we might need. So I hope I'm answering your question, Celestine, because every case is going to be unique. The timing aspect, right, is really related to what is it that you want to, and then what's the cycle on which you have your funders or your grantors operate. But the key thing is always clarifying the vision. And I like the logic model tool because it does enable you to, even at a very high level, I mean, we didn't spend very long. There's obviously more layers to what we would have discussed, but at the very least, we would have been able to say at a high level, if my objective is, or my outcome is that I want the kids in this community to be more well-rounded, to have greater access to education and recreation. And the way that we're going to achieve that is via a community center. You can already identify 3 or 4 major activities that are going to need to occur, and then extrapolate from that, what are the inputs and what's the timing that you need to apply to achieve it. Any other thoughts on that, Celestine, or anyone else? Any other comments, or anyone would like to kind of work through or think through an example of a practical situation that they're in now, or a grant that they would have received, and kind of starting to think of how to break it down? All right, so that's a key part of your project planning, and this should be done at the outset or as early as possible. You know, you may have to revisit it to be able to then guide you into a more successful implementation. So a successful project requires many elements to come together, and it's never perfect, right? So even after you've made your plan, a realistic and well-organized plan, implementing a project is going to require flexibility, creativity, good communication, and a good team. So for some of the folks that would have been directly responsible for planning or implementing a project once a grant has received, could any of you share any pitfalls, any train wrecks, any lessons learned that you've taken from implementing your own projects? Johnny, I don't know if you would want to jump in. You seem to do training and have quite a bit of experience. Cynthia, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I think one of the greatest pitfalls, or one of the threats, is COVID-19 for us, because we started this Sky project in 2019, and we still have not completed. We're still at the assessment and certification stage. We should have completed this the first cohort within a year. And because of COVID-19, our institutions were closed for quite some time. Many of our learners didn't have access to internet, neither devices, and so we were not able to conduct some of our classes online. So that was a delay in the implementation.
What did your team do? How did you respond?
Well, what we did, those who had access, we did online. For those courses where all learners had access, we went through the online training. Those who didn't have access, we just had to wait until institutions open, and then we went back face to face. So that really delayed the implementation of the project
significantly.
Yes, and during this process now, we lost some of our learners because they demotivated. They think that it took too long for them to complete the course, and we have issues now having them to come in to be assessed. Yes, you see the gap between the training and assessment.
Yes,
very wide.
So you had some fall off, some attrition due to engagement and due to the longer time frame that things would have required. All right. Anyone else?
we've learned many lessons from these experiences, and we had to continue doing our SWOT analysis. You know, what are the strengths, what are weaknesses, what are the threats, what are the opportunities that we can capitalize on, what lessons that we learned, and you know, how can we use this and these lessons to improve on the project and to look at the implementation of future projects.
Absolutely. And COVID-19 is something that I think, I'm trying to think of what sector or there would have been very few projects that would have been completely resilient to the impact of COVID. And so you found that many teams were in a similar situation, especially those related to education. I think education was one of the most harshly impacted sectors. And when you think about that kind of not necessarily a national disaster, but a pandemic type activity. Naomi, this is your hand up. Would you like to make a comment?
Yes, this is in reference to the same question, but this is more like a tip. One of the things we recognize is that you can't control everything. What the said a while ago in terms of COVID-19, there are other factors that typically play into your plan. So you may plan all of the things like, for example, there was one project we had to do. It was supposed to start in December last year, and it ended up starting in March of this year. By that time, prices of a lot of the items we had to procure had gone up. The budget would have to be reshuffled again. So it's like always project, you have to be open and flexible, and always looking for ways to have an alternative, always having a plan B, C, D in case something that.
Absolutely. And that flexibility is one of the key hallmarks, because no matter how well planned, the plan is a guide that's going to help you to articulate and always revisit what you wanted to achieve. However, the plan and then what actually occurs is often a wide open difference. So you may have your plan, but if you don't have a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of creativity and communication with your funders, your stakeholders, etc., you know, something can happen. One of a risk that was previously a risk can now materialize and throw your entire implementation off track. Zara has in the chat pitfalls she's encountered: not having a strong enough team, sometimes too many people who have other commitments, or not enough people, and then not doing enough M&E, even in the most basic stage of reporting and postmortems, end up making the same mistakes. And I think those are two really important points. The resourcing in terms of the team, sometimes too many people, as you've said, and sometimes who are not committed, or sometimes not enough people. In the nonprofit world, that's a constant challenge that we need to face off. Sometimes you work with a community of volunteers. Well, volunteer time is usually predictable. Volunteers are volunteering, so there's always a risk of a higher priority, something else that needs to be done that takes precedent over this work here. Or maybe you can't find the people that you actually would need, right? Or you can't find all of the right expertise or resources. So that's a huge risk area, which again is why writing project proposals or project plans that are too ambitious just increase that risk. The multiple number of activities that you're going to be trying to implement in a short amount of time means that you need stronger and more resources, human resources, to execute it. So if you're front loading a training program, a vaccination program, a infrastructure renovation, and building an app all in 18 months, you're really increasing your risk there of being able to find all of those people that you're going to need to implement. Are you going to be able to pay them? And then are they going to be successful at working together, or are they going to be volunteering on other things and only have a piecemeal amount of time? I always say it's better to do fewer things well than try to do many things poorly. Anyone else want to comment on any pitfalls or experiences that you've had to learn from in implementing projects?
Hi, Novia. I just wanted to say something quickly, something that both you and Elizabeth referred to in your logic models as you presented. It comes back to risks and assumptions. And I don't think there's any project moving forward or any grant proposal moving forward that would not have the possibility of critical climate or pandemic-like challenges in there. And it's important to put this as a risk. As we've seen, that's the big lesson learned from 2019 and the COVID experience, that even though the waves may, as they are right now, coming and going in terms of COVID-19, the reasons why donors want to see your risk and mitigation plan is for particularly that reason. They want to know that you have thought out your risks, including relating to staffing, but also what you plan to do about it. Now, some things you're gonna be unable to predict, but that's why even managing, even in your implementation plan, is to constantly look quarterly or at least biannually, that you look at your risks and assumptions and see if they still hold. Outline those risks carefully, but most importantly, outlining those risks really is about figuring out your mitigation plan. So you're not scrambling at the end when you come upon the risk to try to figure out what to do. That's the time, again, that you liaise with your stakeholders and say, okay, all right, this is the type of program that means a lot of interaction with our target groups. If we can't reach them our traditional way, what's plan B? What's plan C? And that's what donors also like to see, is that you actually have thought out these risks carefully and have a plan to mitigate it. And not to take that component of the grant writing process, even in your implementation plan, you take that not very seriously, but it's important to keep those things up front within your context. Thanks.
Absolutely, absolutely. And risk management is, as you said, Shelley, is a key part of helping to protect and to not even secure, because in these days, there's no 100% security, but what it certainly shows one that you've thought it through, and then helps you to be more nimble in your execution. Elizabeth, did you want to comment?
Yes, and I just wanted to say that it also informs your sustainability planning as well. So it actually is a great way for you to begin to think about, well, how will we sustain our outcomes by already beginning to think about those risks, potential risks that may occur.
That's true. And your lessons learned and the next grant that you write could be a follow-up with those risks. And that second step, when we tried to do this, we had this risk, we weren't able to really mitigate it. But in this new grant, we want to do something larger. And based on that lessons learned, this is what we're going to implement instead, which can help confirm or stabilize your next project as you make it a little bit bigger to incorporate the risks that might be more consistent in the future.
Absolutely. And I think Zara alluded to that in her comment. So, a lot of times, folks, we are doing projects informally all around us, right? Whether or not we're project managers, etc. If I could leave you with a takeaway for today, it would be learn the basics in terms of the methodology and see how your organization can actually evolve to adapt them. And I give you the example because there is a strong component of behavior change involved with cultivating project methodologies and cultivating the skills in that area. So Zara mentioned not doing enough M&E, and even in the most basic stage of reporting and postmortems, we end up making the same mistakes. So you can do the lessons learned, you can collect it and go through the pain of the project, but does your organization have a habit that when new projects or new opportunities are undertaken, you revisit okay, what went wrong the last time that we tried to do this? What did we learn from our last experiences? How are we going to adapt the way that we do what we have in front of us to reflect that? That now is a behavior, that is a part of your culture of your organization. And I feel like the more people that get embedded within organizations that do some sort of even if it's not necessarily going for the PMP, but some sort of a project management training, part of what we need to do is to help to shift the culture of the organization towards not just thinking strategically and planning carefully, but also learning from our previous experiences. Because if we collect the lessons and we can point out what's wrong, but we make the same mistakes, we write the same unrealistic projects, we do the same timelines that don't consider mobilization, or we engage the same partners that were not effective before, then you find that you continue to waste money and you dilute your own credibility in terms of successful execution. So cultivating, being aware of the necessary behaviors and embedding them within your daily practice of the cycles of, writing grants, planning projects, executing, monitoring, communicating. It's really cultivating that behavior that's going to help us to, let's think about M&E up front. Let's think about sustainability up front. Let's think about risk up front. Let's look back at our lessons. Some of that, no, it's really about developing the practice and helping your organization to come along with seeing the benefit of such practices. Of course, closing a project, and yes, just Mizara, we're on the same page. Just one question: what is it that one would need to consider if their project is behind schedule and is considering fast tracking? Okay, so for you to be able to consider if your project is behind schedule, you would really need to have had a timed and costed work plan as well. But your work plan should be scheduled. Now, that I find is a weak point among the nonprofit world, because the timelines are often not built out in a very detailed way, and then we're not tracking against our timeline. So in the formal project management space, we use tools such as Microsoft Project to input our timesheets and to be able to baseline our schedule and know when we're going off, right? Now, there are several, what I would like to call them, layperson tools, such as Smart Sheets, and there's a couple of others like, Asana and those project management tools. They're not going to tell you if you're behind schedule, but Smart Sheet for one is a pretty good example, where you can, do your planning, say, all right, guys, we're building a community center. We're going to take 6 months to do the infrastructure. And during that 6 months, we're going to take 3 months to build out the programs and another 3 months to hire the folks. And then we're at the end now, we're going to have a 1-month launch period, right? Now, once you realistically establish those timelines, you need to set a baseline and know what was my target. So if I had 5 milestones, which should have been build the community center, hire staff, create program, launch. I know that within all of those, there are subtasks that are going to help me to know that are really going to break down the work. But if I give myself an overall runway of 18 months, and I know that after building and hiring, I need 6 months to plan the launch, if I've gone into month 8 and I haven't started building anything, I know that I'm behind schedule. So that means I now need to look at what can I fast track, what resources I can use to get my project back on track. So being able to determine when your project is off schedule is, first of all, a focus of your planning, right? And then if you're wanting to consider, what's the best method to make up the time? What's my recovery plan? Then you really need to understand what's the problem. So if you're behind schedule in building out the infrastructure of your community center, is it because supply chain disruptions are causing things to take longer to come? Or is it that your construction company is not sending enough workers to build it faster? Can you solve any of those problems? Can you shift suppliers and purchase items that are available locally? Right? Can you change your contractor to one who's going to deploy more people? Right? And then if your construction element is running behind, can you bring forward any other activities that could be done in the meantime? So, all right, construction is still happening. let me start building out the programs. Let me start identifying who's going to do the art, who's going to do the environment, who's going to build the garden. Let me do some work in parallel so that while that work is delayed, I'm advancing other. Let me start planning my launch. Let me start designing the flyers and the artifacts and the logos so that when the build catches up, I've already put the other pieces in place to help. So Bernadette, I think that was your question. Does that answer your question? Do you want to add anything more to that? And really and truly talking about scheduling and milestone planning, I mean, that could be a whole talk in and of itself, right? Definitely no way that we can cover that in detail in an introductory session, but there is an art to projecting your time so that you can identify, okay, and using a tool to see when I'm actually off track or when I'm on schedule. Closing your project, you definitely want to gather your documentation. You want to close out any of your payments or your contracts. You want to ensure that you do your evaluations, your communication, and that you work on the measures to sustain the gain. So the sustainability measures that you talked about at the top, now that you're coming close to the end, have we started putting those in place? Are the stakeholders that are going to be responsible for some element of the sustainability, are they aware? Have they been involved? Are they ready to take over? Those are all questions that you would have in the discussion of a measurement or measures to sustain. All right, I'm going to close the presentation with just a last slide on what are some of the essential qualities of a project manager. Some people are very well suited to projects, but we can all grow and build in different areas. Some of the keys that are really, I think, critical: you need to be able to listen. You need to have vision, because as a project manager, people look to you to lead, to help to keep them on track, to see the big picture as well as the little picture. It requires quite a bit of self and social awareness, in emotional intelligence, but being able to think innovatively and to solve problems, being creative, responding to setbacks that will undoubtedly come, and of course, manage and communicate with people. So all of these and more really make up the essentials of project management. And what I find useful is to look at those and say, well, where am I strong and where can I improve? How can I build some of those skills so that as I venture more, I can be more effective in projects? Because in addition to mastering the methodology, mastering yourself and your team is just as critical to success. So I'm going to actually end the presentation here. I'm going to hand back over to Iceline or Abby if they're on the call. And of course, open up to see if there are any final questions from our participants.
Yes, thank you so much, Novia. So are there any final questions from anyone on the floor right now? I think we've had some really great interaction and discussion, so I want to thank you all so much already. I've enjoyed the discussion. Are there any other questions from anyone that we can take at this time for Novia or Elizabeth or Shelley? No, if not, great. So you will receive, so for those of you who attended and registered, you will receive a copy of the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint. We will send that out to you with our little newsletter that we usually send after our webinars. And so I do want to at this time thank Novia for the presentation and for this engaging discussion. I thought it went really well. Thank you so much also to Elizabeth and Shelley for helping her with facilitating. Thank you all for participating, all of you who showed up and for engaging. I think this is what makes for a really good learning opportunity. It's not always easy when we're on Zoom to engage as we would in person, but I think we did a really good job today. And thank you for the information. So just before we close out, I do want to let everybody know. So this is, I think as Novia had mentioned, this is a 3-part series of capacity building webinars that we're hosting. And the next one is scheduled for next month. I'm going to share my screen. So we were talking about, we've talked about grant writing, we've talked about project management today, and of course, the next aspect is monitoring and evaluation. We did see in the comments, persons were mentioning that monitoring and evaluation is always a weak aspect, especially for us in nonprofits. So we'll have next month on August 13th, Shelley is going to facilitate a session on monitoring and evaluation and how we can do that a lot more effectively in our organizations and in our spaces for the projects that we do execute and the grants that we're successful at gaining, because of course we know sustainability is always a question on these grant applications. So there's a plug there. So you will receive a notice of this again in the newsletter that we'll send out with the PDF of the presentation and a recording. So do look out for that. And of course, encourage others who you may know who may benefit from the information. So these are some free workshops that we're offering. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which will be next month, on August 13th, with Shelley as our main facilitator. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.